The wind hit different in the high valleys of Montana Territory. James Fletcher learned that in the winter of 1887, when his neighbor's cabin dropped to minus 10 degrees inside despite burning wood all night, the neighbor had built his cabin exactly the way every homesteader manual said to build it: hewn spruce logs, moss chinking, tight and proven. By January, he was burning through 3 cords of wood and still shivering by his own fire. Across Montana Territory, settlers were fighting the same losing battle in cabins built by the book and failing by the freeze. When James chose to live inside a massive hollow cedar tree instead of building a proper cabin, neighbors called him crazy. That winter, when outside temperatures hit minus 50 degrees, James's tree home stayed warm and comfortable, while standard cabins around him turned into ice boxes. We'll break down the exact principles and measurements behind his impossible result. What did he understand about natural insulation that every other frontier builder had completely missed? The high valleys of western Montana Territory stretched like frozen arteries through the Continental Divide, where old-growth cedar and fir stands had weathered centuries of wind-scoured winters. Deep snowpack buried the scattered trapper roots by November, leaving only the hardiest settlers to face months of isolation in their hastily built shelters. James Fletcher had spent the previous 5 seasons running trap lines through these forests, sleeping in lean-tos and learning the hard lessons of mountain survival. When he decided to homestead permanently in the valley, he brought with him knowledge that most incoming settlers lacked. The conventional wisdom among homesteaders seemed reasonable enough. Build a simple one-room log cabin using hewn spruce or pine logs, chink the gaps with moss and clay, and top it with a sod roof if boards weren't available. The method required minimal time and lumber, which meant a man could get his family inside before the deep freeze arrived. Homestead guides and territorial manuals all recommended the same approach: build quick, get shelter, survive winter with a good stove and plenty of firewood. Most settlers figured that logs were abundant, manpower was limited, and winters were predictable enough that a simple structure would suffice. James visited his 2 nearest neighbors in early December to see how their cabins were performing. Both had followed the standard method religiously. The first cabin, built by Henry Thompson just 4 months earlier, had already developed serious problems. Despite outside temperatures holding steady at minus 40 degrees for 3 consecutive days, the interior had dropped to minus 10 degrees overnight. Wind infiltration through the chinking created constant drafts, and heavy condensation froze on the interior walls each morning. Thompson had stacked 3 full cords of seasoned pine beside his cabin in October, but he was already burning through his second cord by Christmas. The second neighbor's situation proved even worse. Sarah Garrett's cabin suffered from the same thermal losses that plagued Thompson's structure, but her location on the windward side of the valley made conditions nearly unbearable. She had built her cabin exactly according to the Territorial Survey Office specifications: 6-inch diameter logs, traditional moss and clay chinking, and a stone fireplace positioned on the gable end. The cabin measured 12 feet by 16 feet with a standard pitched roof. Yet despite continuous stoking of her cast iron stove, cold spots near the walls registered 15 degrees below the center room temperature. Garrett was forced to keep her water bucket next to the stove to prevent freezing, and she wore her heaviest coat inside the cabin throughout December. James observed that both cabins shared the same fundamental weakness. The standard log construction provided minimal thermal mass, and the 6-inch wall thickness allowed rapid heat conduction to the exterior. More critically, the chinking method created numerous points where cold air infiltrated and warm air escaped. Even when settlers packed the gaps carefully with moss and sealed them with clay, the materials shrank and cracked as they dried, opening pathways for wind-driven heat loss. These failures didn't surprise James. During his trapping years, he had learned winter survival from a Blackfeet elder named Chief Akacheta, who had shown him how indigenous shelters use natural materials and forms to maintain warmth. Akacheta had demonstrated how bark-walled lodges and natural hollows in large trees stayed comfortable because they incorporated thick insulation layers and minimized wind entry points. The old man had also taught James to observe how animals denned in hollow trees during harsh weather, taking advantage of the natural thermal mass that massive wood provided. James also carried knowledge from his immigrant heritage. His father, Jacob, had worked as a timber framer in the Swiss Alps before emigrating to America in the 1850s. Jacob had described the Alpine barn construction methods that used heavy timber walls filled with clay and straw insulation to withstand mountain winters. The old man had emphasized that successful cold weather building required understanding three principles: thermal mass to store heat, insulation to prevent heat loss, and tight construction to eliminate air infiltration. When James announced his intention to abandon conventional cabin construction and instead move into a massive fire-hollowed cedar tree he had discovered, his neighbors reacted with open mockery. The tree stood 8 feet in diameter at the base, with a natural hollow interior that measured roughly 6 feet across and 12 feet in height. Thompson declared the plan pure foolishness and predicted that James would freeze before January ended. Garrett worried aloud that the tree would collapse or catch fire, trapping James inside. Even the territorial homestead inspector raised concerns about the unconventional shelter, questioning whether it would meet basic safety requirements. James understood their skepticism, but he had already begun developing a systematic approach based on principles rather than convention. The hollow cedar offered 3 feet of solid wood thickness surrounding the living space, providing thermal mass that no 6-inch log wall could match. The tree's natural cylindrical shape would eliminate the sharp corners and flat surfaces that created cold spots in rectangular cabins. Most importantly, the existing hollow meant he could focus his energy on insulation and sealing rather than basic structural work. As December deepened into the harshest winter in memory, James began implementing techniques that combined indigenous knowledge with immigrant craftsmanship. His approach challenged every assumption about frontier building, but early results suggested that traditional wisdom might outperform modern convenience. The real test would come when January brought the killing cold that had claimed so many poorly prepared settlers in previous years. James began working on the hollow cedar tree in early January when morning temperatures held steady at -20 degrees. The massive trunk required different thinking than conventional construction. Rather than building walls from scratch, he needed to optimize the natural cavity that fire had carved decades earlier. The interior space measured 6 feet across at its widest point, tapering slightly toward the top, with rough charred surfaces that provided natural texture for holding insulation materials. Chief Akacheta visited the site on a bitter morning when frost crystals hung motionless in the air. The old Blackfeet elder examined the cedar's interior walls. Running his weathered hands along the charred surface, he explained how his people had long understood that massive wood acted as a heat reservoir, absorbing warmth slowly during the day and releasing it gradually through the night. The principle worked because wood stored thermal energy within its cellular structure, creating what Akacheta called the tree's memory of warmth. A wall 3 feet thick could hold heat for hours after a fire died, while thin log walls lost their warmth within minutes of reduced heating. The elder showed James how to prepare the insulation layers that would line the interior cavity. Traditional indigenous practice called for gathering specific types of moss that grew on the north sides of old trees, where constant moisture created dense, fibrous mats. This moss, when dried and compressed, trapped countless air pockets that blocked heat transfer. Akacheta demonstrated the proper technique for harvesting and preparing the material, emphasizing that the moss must be completely dry before installation to prevent interior condensation and rot. James collected over 40 pounds of this moss during 3 separate gathering expeditions. He spread the material on wooden racks positioned near his temporary cooking fire, turning it regularly until each handful felt crisp and springy. The dried moss compressed to roughly 1/3 of its original volume while retaining its insulating properties. When properly prepared, a 4-inch layer of this material could reduce heat loss through a surface by more than 70% compared to bare wood. The clay component of the insulation system drew from Jacob's alpine construction methods. James located a deposit of dense clay soil near a creek bend where seasonal flooding had concentrated fine particles. He dug through 2 feet of frozen ground to reach workable material, then mixed the clay with water in a ratio that created a paste thick enough to hold its shape, when pressed against vertical surfaces. Jakob had taught his son that proper clay plaster should contain enough moisture to remain workable, but not so much that it would crack extensively as it dried. The application process required systematic layering. James first pressed handfuls of prepared moss against the charred interior walls, working from bottom to top in horizontal bands. Each layer overlapped the previous one by several inches, creating a continuous insulating blanket with no gaps or thin spots. The moss naturally caught in the rough bark texture, holding itself in place without additional fasteners. Over the moss, James applied the clay plaster in smooth, even strokes, using a wooden paddle carved from birch. The clay served multiple functions beyond simple insulation. It sealed air gaps between moss fibers, added thermal mass that helped moderate temperature swings, and created a smooth interior surface that reflected firelight more efficiently than rough wood. The clay also hardened as it dried, forming a protective shell that prevented the moss from shifting or settling over time. The door presented the most critical sealing challenge. Conventional cabin doors often fit poorly in their frames, allowing significant air exchange that defeated even the best wall insulation. James crafted his door from 3 layers of split cedar boards, with the grain running in alternating directions to prevent warping. Between the layers, he packed additional moss and sealed the edges with clay, creating a door nearly 4 inches thick that weighed over 60 pounds. The door frame required equally careful attention. James carved a rabbet along the frame's inner edge, creating a stepped surface that allowed the door to seat deeply when closed. He lined this rabbet with strips of prepared elk hide the Chief Akachita had provided, creating a gasket that compressed when the door closed and expanded to fill gaps when moisture changes caused slight movements in the wood. By late January, the insulation system was complete. The tree's interior now featured a 3-layer thermal barrier, the original 3 feet of solid cedar heartwood, 4 inches of compressed moss insulation, and a half-inch clay plaster finish. This combination provided thermal performance that conventional cabin construction could not approach. The first major test came during a week-long cold snap when outside temperatures dropped to minus 45 degrees. James maintained detailed temperature records using a mercury thermometer positioned at chest height in the center of the space. With a small wood stove burning approximately 6 hours per day, the interior temperature stabilized at 58 degrees. The inner wall surface, when tested with his hand, felt noticeably warm to the touch even near the door. Meanwhile, Thompson's conventional cabin struggled with the same weather. Despite burning his stove continuously, interior temperatures fluctuated between 15 and 30 degrees, with cold spots near the walls dropping below zero. Thompson reported that frost formed on the interior walls each night and that his water froze solid unless kept within 3 feet of the stove. The performance difference validated James's systematic approach to thermal control. The massive wood walls absorbed heat during active burning periods and released it steadily when the stove was cold. The insulation layers prevented rapid heat loss to the exterior, while the clay plaster moderated interior temperature swings by adding thermal mass that responded slowly to changes in heat input. The cylindrical shape of the cedar cavity created heat circulation patterns that James had not anticipated. Unlike rectangular cabins where warm air rose straight up and stayed trapped against the ceiling, the curved walls of the tree hollow guided heated air in a continuous spiral flow. James discovered this phenomenon during his first week of occupancy when he noticed that the temperature differential between floor and ceiling measured only 8 degrees compared to the 20-degree difference that Thompson reported in his square cabin. Chief Akacheta explained the principle during another visit in February. He traced the air movement with his finger, showing how warmed air from the stove rose along the curved wall, traveled around the circumference near the top of the cavity, then gradually descended toward the center as it cooled. This circulation pattern prevented the dead air zones that plagued rectangular structures, where sharp corners trapped stagnant cold air that never mixed with the heated atmosphere. The elder noted that his people had observed similar airflow in natural caves and had incorporated curved shapes into their winter lodges, specifically to encourage this gentle circulation. The stove placement became critical to optimizing this natural air movement. James positioned his 18-inch diameter firebox not in the center of the space as conventional wisdom suggested, but offset toward the southeast wall approximately 18 inches from the curved perimeter. This placement created an asymmetrical heating pattern that initiated the circular airflow more effectively than a central heat source would have achieved. Jakob's knowledge of Scandinavian barn design influenced James's understanding of how heated air behaved in round structures. His father had described grain storage buildings in Norway that used circular floor plans to maintain even temperatures throughout large interior spaces. The Norwegian builders positioned their heating sources strategically to take advantage of natural convection currents that curved walls created. Jakob had emphasized that round buildings heated more efficiently than square ones because they eliminated the sharp angles where cold air accumulated and stagnated. The stovepipe installation required careful engineering to support the circulation pattern. James extended the pipe vertically for 8 feet before allowing it to exit through the tree's crown, creating maximum heat exchange with the rising air column. The pipe's surface area transferred additional warmth to the ascending airstream, which then carried that heat around the curved wall before descending on the opposite side of the cavity. This configuration extracted more usable heat from the exhaust gases than conventional straight pipe installations achieved. Orientation played an equally important role in the tree dwelling's thermal performance. The natural hollow faced southeast, which provided morning solar exposure while protecting the entrance from the prevailing northwest winds that dominated Montana winters. James had not chosen this orientation deliberately, but Chief Akacheta pointed out that the positioning followed traditional indigenous principles for winter camp placement. The elder explained how his people always positioned lodge entrances to catch early morning sunlight, which provided passive heating before daily fires were built up. Southeast orientation also meant that the dwelling's opening faced away from the storm winds that typically approached from the northwest, reducing cold air infiltration during blizzards. The tree's massive trunk naturally blocked these prevailing winds, creating a wind shadow that extended several feet beyond the entrance. James enhanced this natural wind protection by constructing a simple baffle wall just inside the door opening. He built this barrier from split cedar planks positioned at a 45-degree angle to the entrance, creating a deflection surface that prevented direct wind entry while still allowing access to the living space. The baffle stood 5 feet high and extended 2 feet into the cavity, forcing entering air to change direction twice before reaching the main living area. The single window opening that James cut faced due south, positioned at eye level approximately 4 feet above the floor. He kept this opening small, measuring only 18 inches square, but oriented it to capture maximum midday sunlight during the short winter days. The window location took advantage of the low winter sun angle, allowing direct sunlight to penetrate deep into the cavity during the crucial midday hours when outdoor temperatures peaked. James covered the window opening with a thin sheet of mica that he had traded from a passing prospector. The mica provided transparency while offering better insulation than glass would have provided. He mounted the mica sheet in a double frame system with a 1/4-inch air gap between 2 layers, creating additional thermal resistance that reduced heat loss through the opening during nighttime hours. The entrance design incorporated lessons from both indigenous and Scandinavian traditions. James built an interior vestibule using a second door positioned 3 feet inside the main entrance. This created an airlock effect that prevented cold outdoor air from flowing directly into the heated living space when the outer door opened. The vestibule measured 4 feet by 3 feet, large enough to store outdoor gear and firewood while providing a buffer zone that moderated temperature exchange. During a severe windstorm in mid-February, when sustained gusts reached 60 miles per hour and temperatures dropped to -38 degrees, the tree dwelling's orientation and shape advantages became dramatically apparent. James recorded interior temperatures that remained stable at 62 degrees throughout the 36-hour storm, with no noticeable drafts or cold spots anywhere in the living space. Thompson's rectangular cabin suffered severe problems during the same storm. The building's flat walls created turbulence that drove wind into every gap and crack in the structure. Cold air infiltrated through the chinking and around the door frame, creating interior wind currents that made heating nearly impossible. Thompson reported that despite continuous stoking, his cabin's interior temperature dropped to 8 degrees above zero, and frost formed on the walls wherever the wind found entry points. The airflow patterns that James observed in his tree dwelling revealed fundamental principles about heating efficiency that conventional cabin construction ignored. The continuous circulation eliminated hot and cold zones, distributed heat evenly throughout the space, and prevented the thermal stratification that wasted fuel in rectangular buildings. These advantages, combined with the structure's natural wind protection and solar orientation, created a heating system that performed far beyond what its modest fuel consumption should have achieved. The January thaw of 1888 brought unexpected challenges that revealed weaknesses in James's initial setup. Temperatures climbed above freezing for 6 consecutive days, melting accumulated snow and creating pools of standing water around the base of the cedar tree. James discovered that meltwater was seeping through the charred floor of the hollow, creating damp patches that threatened to undermine the entire heating system. The moisture also began to affect his stored firewood, which he had stacked directly on the tree's natural floor. The problem forced James to confront an issue that conventional cabin builders often ignored until it was too late. Sarah Garrett's cabin had already begun showing signs of moisture damage, with dark stains appearing on her interior walls, where melting snow had found its way through gaps in the roof, chinking. Thompson reported similar issues, along with a musty odor that suggested mold growth within the wall structure. Both neighbors were burning increasingly damp firewood, which produced less heat per cord while creating more smoke and creosote buildup in their stovepipes. Chief Akacheta arrived during the thaw to check on James's progress and immediately identified the moisture infiltration problem. The elder explained that his people had long understood the superior properties of western red cedar heartwood for moisture control. Unlike pine or spruce, which absorbed water readily and rotted quickly when exposed to dampness, cedar heartwood contained natural oils and compounds that resisted both moisture penetration and decay. The Blackfeet had used cedar for lodge poles and storage containers, specifically because it maintained its structural integrity even in wet conditions. The cedar tree's heartwood demonstrated these properties throughout the winter. While the outer bark layers showed typical moisture absorption and freeze-thaw cracking, the inner heartwood remained dimensionally stable and showed no signs of rot or insect damage. Chief Akacheta pointed out that the natural oils in cedar heartwood actually repelled moisture rather than absorbing it, creating a natural vapor barrier that helped regulate humidity within the enclosed space. Jacob's alpine construction knowledge provided the solution for the floor moisture problem. James recalled his father's descriptions of Swiss barn foundations that used elevated timber floors built on stone pads to prevent ground moisture from rotting floor beams. The technique involved creating a raised platform that allowed air circulation underneath while providing drainage for seasonal water accumulation. James began constructing an elevated floor system inside the tree hollow using split cedar planks supported by a framework of smaller cedar beams. He positioned the floor joists on flat stones that he collected from the nearby creek bed, creating supports that elevated the living surface 18 inches above the natural tree floor. This elevation provided crucial airspace that allowed moisture to evaporate rather than accumulating beneath the living area. The stone foundation served multiple functions beyond simple moisture control. The stones absorbed heat from the interior space during the day and radiated that warmth back into the air gap beneath the floor during cooler periods. This thermal mass effect helped moderate temperature swings in the floor system and prevented the formation of cold spots that plagued ground-level floors in conventional cabins. James arranged the stones in a circular pattern that followed the tree's natural curve, creating a stable foundation that distributed weight evenly across the hollow's floor. Between the floor joists, James packed additional insulation using a mixture of dried moss and small stones. This combination provided thermal resistance while allowing air circulation that prevented moisture accumulation. The stones created drainage channels that directed any infiltrating water toward the tree's natural hollow edge, where it could drain away from the living space rather than pooling beneath the floorboards. The elevated floor system eliminated the cold floor problem that plagued both neighboring cabins. James measured floor surface temperatures that remained within 5 degrees of the air temperature at chest height, compared to Thompson's cabin, where the floor stayed 20 to 30 degrees colder than the room air. This temperature consistency meant that James could walk barefoot comfortably inside his dwelling, while his neighbors required heavy boots even indoors during cold snaps. Fuel management became another critical advantage of the tree dwelling's design. James discovered that firewood stored along the interior wall, where it benefited from radiant heat from the thermal mass, dried to optimal moisture content much faster than wood stored outside. He built simple wooden racks that held split wood vertically against the curved wall, positioning them far enough from the stove to prevent fire risk, but close enough to benefit from the wall's stored heat. The passive wood drying system proved remarkably effective. Firewood stacked against the warm interior wall reached moisture content below 15% within 2 weeks, compared to outdoor stored wood that maintained moisture levels above 30% throughout the winter. The drier wood burned more efficiently, producing more heat per piece while creating less smoke and creosote. James calculated that he extracted approximately 30% more usable heat from each cord of wood compared to his neighbors who burned unseasoned or partially damp fuel. The wood storage system also contributed to the dwelling's thermal performance. The stacked firewood created an additional insulation layer against the interior wall, reducing heat loss while simultaneously improving fuel quality. James arranged his wood racks in sections that allowed him to rotate stock systematically, ensuring that the driest wood was always available for burning while newly split wood dried in the warmest positions. By early March, the durability advantages of James's system became apparent through direct comparison with neighboring structures. The cedar heartwood showed no signs of deterioration, despite months of interior heating and cooling cycles. The elevated floor remained dry and structurally sound, with no warping or splitting of the planks. The stone foundation had settled into stable positions that provided solid support without shifting or sinking. Meanwhile, both Thompson and Garrett reported significant structural problems. Thompson discovered that several of his floor joists had developed soft spots where ground moisture had promoted rot, requiring immediate replacement to prevent collapse. Garrett found extensive mold growth on her interior walls where condensation had accumulated throughout the winter, creating health concerns and requiring complete removal and replacement of affected chinking. The fuel efficiency differences had become dramatic by winter's end. James calculated that he had consumed 1 3/4 cords of wood during the 4-month heating season, while Thompson had burned nearly 4 cords and Garrett had used over 3.5 cords. The dry storage system had eliminated the energy waste that occurred when wet wood was burned, while the elevated floor had reduced the heating load by maintaining consistent temperature throughout the living space. Water management around the tree's base proved equally important for long-term durability. James dug drainage channels that directed snowmelt and spring runoff away from the tree's root system and hollow entrance. He lined these channels with flat stones that prevented erosion while providing permanent pathways for seasonal water flow. This drainage system protected both the tree's structural integrity and the dwelling's interior from future moisture infiltration events. The winter of 1891 arrived with meteorological conditions that territorial weather observers would later document as the most severe cold period in recorded Montana history. Beginning on January 15th, a high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies and remained stationary for 40 consecutive days. Surface temperatures averaged minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit across the region, with nighttime readings frequently dropping below minus 60 degrees. Wind speeds remained consistently above 25 miles per hour, creating wind chill factors that reached minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme conditions created a natural experiment that tested every aspect of frontier building technique across western Montana. Standard log cabin construction began failing within the first week of the deep freeze. Henry Thompson's cabin suffered a catastrophic chinking failure when the clay mortar contracted and cracked under the sustained cold, opening gaps up to 2 inches wide along major log joints. Cold air poured through these openings faster than his stove could compensate, dropping interior temperatures to minus 15 degrees despite continuous firing. Sarah Garrett faced even worse conditions. Her cabin's stovepipe froze solid on the morning of January 22nd when moisture from combustion condensed and turned to ice inside the flue. With no way to safely operate her stove, interior temperatures plummeted to -5 degrees within 6 hours. Garrett was forced to abandon her cabin and seek shelter with neighbors, leaving behind most of her possessions and food stores. Across the valley, 3 other homestead cabins were abandoned during the first 2 weeks of the freeze. The common failure pattern involved stovepipe freezing, chinking failure, or roof collapse under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Families fled to the territorial town of Missoula, leaving their cabins and livestock to face the remainder of winter unprotected. Those who managed to maintain occupancy burned through fuel supplies at unprecedented rates, with average consumption reaching 5 cords of wood during the 40-day period. James maintained detailed temperature and fuel consumption records throughout the crisis using a mercury thermometer and careful measurement of his wood consumption. Despite external temperatures that averaged -50 degrees, his tree dwelling maintained interior temperatures that fluctuated between 60 and 70 degrees. The thermal mass of the cedar walls absorbed and released heat so efficiently that temperature variations rarely exceeded 5 degrees, even when the stove burned low between loading cycles. The fuel efficiency during the extreme cold period validated every aspect of James's integrated system. He reloaded his stove only once every 48 hours using split cedar that had been thoroughly dried against the interior wall. Total wood consumption for the entire 40-day period measured slightly less than 1 full cord, representing an 80% fuel savings compared to the average cabin consumption during the same period. The stove operation itself required minimal attention due to the dwelling's superior heat retention characteristics. James loaded the firebox with approximately 15 pounds of dried cedar each morning and evening, creating a burn pattern that provided steady heat output for 24-hour periods. The massive wall system absorbed excess heat during peak burning and released it gradually as the fire burned down, maintaining comfortable temperatures without the constant stoking that conventional cabins required. On February 18th, during the coldest night of the entire siege, when external temperatures dropped to -62 degrees, James recorded interior wall surface temperatures that remained above 50 degrees. He measured the temperature gradient through different sections of the tree dwelling and found remarkable consistency. Floor temperatures held at 64 degrees, chest height air temperature measured 66 degrees, and the ceiling area reached 68 degrees. The structural integrity of the tree dwelling never wavered throughout the extreme conditions. The cedar heartwood showed no signs of cracking, splitting, or movement despite temperature differentials that exceeded 100 degrees between exterior and interior surfaces. The elevated floor system remained stable and level, with no warping or separation of the planking. The moss and clay insulation layers maintained their effectiveness without settling or developing gaps that would have compromised thermal performance. When the high-pressure system finally broke on February 25th, bringing temperatures back to normal winter ranges, James emerged from the ordeal with his dwelling undamaged and his fuel supplies largely intact. He had consumed less wood during the worst cold period in territorial history than his neighbors typically burned during an average winter month. Word of the tree dwelling's performance spread throughout the valley during the spring thaw. Thompson visited the site in March to examine the construction techniques firsthand, spending several hours measuring wall thickness, inspecting the insulation layers, and questioning James about stove placement and operation procedures. Sarah Garrett brought her husband and 2 other homesteaders to study the elevated floor system and the wood drying arrangements along the interior walls. Thomas Richardson, the territorial forest ranger responsible for monitoring remote homesteads, arrived in April to document James's dwelling for inclusion in his annual report to territorial administrators. Richardson measured interior dimensions, recorded construction materials and techniques, and calculated fuel efficiency data that he planned to include in recommendations for isolated trap camps and remote ranger stations. His official report noted that the tree dwelling had achieved fuel consumption rates 60 to 70% lower than conventional cabins, while maintaining superior interior comfort during extreme weather conditions. Richardson's documentation proved influential in subsequent territorial building recommendations. His circular to remote station operators describe the key principles behind James's success: thermal mass for heat storage, layered insulation for heat retention, circular airflow for even temperature distribution, and elevated floors for moisture control. While few trappers had access to suitable hollow trees, the underlying techniques could be adapted to conventional log construction with significant performance improvements. By the early 1900s, homestead cabins throughout the northern Rockies began incorporating elements derived from James's system. Settlers built thicker log walls using double wall construction with insulation layers between inner and outer log surfaces. Raised floor systems became standard practice for cabins built in areas prone to snow, accumulation, and spring flooding. Circular or octagonal cabin designs appeared occasionally, built by homesteaders who understood the heating advantages of curved wall systems. The most widespread adoption involved the use of moss and clay insulation in log wall construction. Territorial supply companies began advertising prepared moss insulation for cabin builders, and clay plaster techniques became common knowledge among frontier carpenters. These modifications typically improve fuel efficiency by 30 to 40% compared to traditional chinking methods, while significantly reducing interior cold spots and drafts. Modern off-grid building techniques still reference principles that James developed during his years in the cedar tree dwelling. Contemporary builders understand that thermal mass, insulation, air circulation, and moisture control must work together as an integrated system rather than individual solutions. The specific techniques have evolved, but the fundamental understanding that James demonstrated, that traditional knowledge often outperforms conventional wisdom when properly applied, continues to influence remote building design throughout the Mountain West.